I think, broadly speaking, if you look across the range of policy pronouncements the government's made, you see three key strands to coalition thinking. You won't find any of these in any individual paper or bill, but I think this is the overall impact. Firstly, we're seeing a lot of emphasis on more power to individuals, more power to choose between services, more power to set up schools. We're seeing more power for communities. We're seeing communities able to bid for services. We're seeing communities given power to elect police commissioners. And finally, we're seeing a bit more power for local government. I think if you look at the localism bill, there is the general power of competence in there. That could be quite important over time. But as we've said several times, I think in the last few weeks, the localism bill is really what you get if you try and decentralise from communities and local government as a department. The big wins for local government are things like total place and the business rate, which require a much more ambitious cross-government effort. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. The reason that I've got this handsome chap up on the screen, this is Joseph Schumpeter. And Schumpeter is the economist who coined the phrase creative destruction. And he thought creative destruction in the private sector drove innovation, drove new ideas. And I think that's very much where the coalitions come from. In fact, some ministers and some MPs will admit that explicitly. The whole point here is not to have, I think, a clear end vision for local government. The coalition doesn't have some grand plan for where you will all end up in 3 or 4 years' time. Instead, the plan is to shake up the entire local government environment, to change schooling, to change policing, to change health, to allow citizens to challenge local government for services, but also to challenge it democratically. And if you create all of those forces, if you open for a free market, creative destruction gets let rip. The interesting question, I think, for local government is what's the balance in there between the creative bit, i.e. new ideas, new roles, and the destructive bit. This is Nick Clegg talking about the whole creative destruction point. He's saying that the political establishment has not admitted that real decentralisation is messy and unpredictable. And I come back to that point about creative destruction. I think the nightmare scenario for anyone who believes in localism and local government is that what happens over the next 3 or 4 years is that councils are so shocked and panicked by the cuts that many of them retreat to core services, start cutting things left, right and centre, and that actually localism becomes synonymous with cuts, becomes synonymous with cheaper and nastier services. And if that happens, I think we set the course of localism back a generation. The more positive scenario, I think, is the creative one. But actually, we of course have to accept that these cuts will be astonishingly difficult. And Catherine will talk about some of that in a minute. But actually, there are new roles for local government to grasp. There are things that councils can do to grasp a more positive and proactive role, to innovate their way out of the cuts, to meet this huge challenge with creativity. And I think the goal for localists is to make sure that there are many more councils in that latter category, creative and innovative, than there are in the former category. What does that mean for local governments? Well, we think over the next few years, the councils that succeed will find creative ways to engage with 5 key trends: retrenching to redeveloping, small steps to giant leaps, wholesale providers retail advisor, elected service provision to a new politics, and place shaping to community development. And I'll talk a bit more about what all of those mean. Firstly, in terms of retrenching to redeveloping, it's pretty clear, I think, that there won't be a huge amount of innovation over the next year. The challenge is just so big that most councils are going to simply be trying to take cost out. And that's fine, that's where we are. We have to be realistic about that. But after that phase of retrenching, we need to enter a new phase of redeveloping. We need that strategic view of where is your local authority going to be in 3 or 4 years' time? What will it do? What are its key roles, its key purposes? How will it serve its communities better? So, we can debate this later, but we think we've probably got about a year or so of retrenching, a really tough pullback. We've probably then got a year of starting to develop and provide new service models. And we hope that for the last 2 years of the spending review period we've seen, we're going to start seeing mainstream service transformation, really new stuff coming out of local government. And obviously the graph that you've got here is the cuts in formula grants. I appreciate that that's not the full picture, but it gives you a sense of the shape of change, I think. From wholesale to retail, I think what's starting to happen, I talked a bit earlier about this, is we are seeing real shake-up of the way that services are provided, and the public service white paper that is due to come out imminently is going to push local government even more down the route of personal budgets and social care, is going to encourage even more the use of the voluntary sector and social enterprise to deliver those services. Essentially, we're moving away from a model where, to caricature, local government was planning provision to one which is much more like a free market, where citizens and communities have much more choice about where they go. And this rather complicated diagram was my attempt to sort of draw out how that's going to work. So obviously you've got communities electing police commissioners, you've got individuals taking personalised budgets, you've got small groups able to set up free schools, you've got communities driving planning to some extent, the big society being able to take over services, and then you've got the local authority, which will have to work out what its role is in a much more kind of free local market of service provision. So some of those roles are probably advising the public about what to choose, so actually customer service becomes much more important. The council may become a bit more like a customer contact centre, making sure that there is enough service out there and then guiding people towards the right thing for them. That's one possible outcome. Providing budgets, obviously service commissioning will be hugely important. And we also think, and I'll talk a bit more about this later, that building the capacity of communities to do things for themselves will be an absolutely critical role. So that's from wholesale to retail. From small steps to giant leaps, what this is really getting at is, I think local government is fantastically good at generating very creative new approaches to service provision. The problem is that there are lots of them and they're very small, and once the funding runs out, they tend to stop. So we've had lots and lots of discussion over the last couple of years about joining up, about preventative working, about new ways of doing all sorts of services. But it's been small, and the challenge now is to take those ideas and make them absolutely mainstream. We have to redesign services around some of those principles that came out of Total Place. So actually, we will probably start doing that pretty quickly in areas like social care. I think a lot of councils have got a transformational approach ready to go in on social care. But we need to start looking across the board at local government services. Where else can we take a really big leap towards transforming those services? So, number 4, from elected service managers to what we've called a new politics. I think that over the last decade, in large part because of inspection, audit, councils have been pushed into this role as kind of elected managers of services and scrutineers. Now, actually, if we've got a free market in local services, if we've got communities able to challenge to run services, if councils are sharing much more, that role for the politicians will have to change quite dramatically. And of course there's a democratic challenge to the legitimacy of local politicians, because citizens will have much more rights in terms of direct democracy. So the role of elected representatives is going to have to change, we think. I can't tell you exactly what that looks like, but I think one really interesting example, and my absolute favourite, is Antonis Locus, the mayor of Bogota. Bogota, one of the most violent cities on the planet, one of the poorest cities in the world. Locus gets elected, and actually one reason he got elected, he's a remarkable political leader. He was the dean of Bogota University, and he was faced with a bunch of rioting students on national television. So Locus's whole response to get them to shut up, he basically turned around and bared his buttocks to them. And they were silent, and it worked. And Locus is he's this incredible politician. He used these kinds of stunts to get people in his city to do things which were unimaginable previously. So some of these pictures, the one at the top, Bogota has tremendous problems with traffic deaths because of awful driving. So Locus hired a troop of mime artists to go onto traffic intersections and shame bad drivers, and there's one of them, shaming a bus driver. Another thing he did, which I think was genius, he put white stars on the pavements everywhere there was traffic fatalities so people could see where it was happening. He decided that one night in the centre of Bogota would be ladies' night, that's the one underneath it. And he said, we want, this is ladies' night out, the men should stay at home, we're only going to have female police on the street. And actually it kind of worked. At one point he said, I want to raise a voluntary tax to fund the city. And it's quite a big one. He said, I want people to volunteer to pay this. And actually quite a lot of people did. It sounds wacky, and it sounds like it shouldn't work, but it did. Actually, after a couple of years, Locus's reforms have reduced homicides by nearly 75% and half traffic fatalities. And he hadn't done that through having some big strategy, he hadn't done that through sending out people to go and tell each other what to do. He'd done that through this incredibly rich style of leadership. And I think it may be that style of leadership, that very entrepreneurial style of leadership that we need to rediscover. The nearest I think we have in London is Boris. And I think I would love to see people on. I think people atrociously to each other on the tube. They don't treat each other like human beings. So I would like to see Boris sending lots of people out onto the tube to be extraordinarily polite. And finally, we've talked a lot in NLGN about the idea of moving from place shaping to community development. It's quite clear, most obviously in the planning and housing reforms, that actually it's going to be communities and neighbourhoods that will have much more power to actually shape place over the next couple of years. It's not that councils will want to shape places, it's not that they won't aspire to do it. But it is that idea that we might have had 3 or 4 years ago of a strong local authority being able to plan across the place. I don't think that vision is going to happen now, so we'll have to reinvent it. The way that we started to think about it is that, yes, there are financial assets in every area, and those are being eroded very dramatically, but there are also social assets. There's social capital, there's spare time, there's trust, and actually we think there's a big role for local government in understanding what those assets are and in managing those, in growing them. That's how you get communities more involved in public service delivery and in a whole load of other things. And plus, actually, it's not even that instrumental. We know from all the research that if you build social capital, you get all sorts of powerful spillover effects. Areas with very high levels of social capital tend to have less crime, higher life expectancy, better health. Social capital is good for you, basically, and local government can build it. And I think a big part of that is about increasing that sense in communities that they can actually run their own destinies. The chart at the top is not mine, it's one I borrowed for a long box. David Howell will be speaking later. But it's quite important. Basically, what it shows is that the UK is quite unusual across Europe. We are very sceptical about the power of the market to secure prosperity in the UK. But we also feel that there's too much state intervention. In other words, we are very sceptical about the 2 main forces that have been shaping our lives for most of the last 50 years. We don't trust either of them, so what else is there? Well, the answer is probably social power. It's about communities being able to do more for themselves and to have more of a say, more control over their destinies. The obvious objection to that, of course, is that social wealth is probably distributed in the same way as economic wealth. If you haven't got much money, you probably also haven't got much social capital. And that's true up to a point. Second wealth correlates the number of people who volunteer in an area without a private activities. And actually the relationship isn't very strong. For those who have status in the audience, it's a 0.3, which wouldn't get you into an academic journal. So yes, poor areas do tend to have a bit less social capital, but it's not an iron rule. And of course there are things we can do to improve it. One of the interesting ones is commuting. Once your commute is over 20 minutes, social capital in the area starts dropping. Now actually there are things that the government can do about that. It's going to be quite controversial territory, but it's quite important. I've talked a lot about what local government will need to do. Now let's move on to what the centre needs to do, because I still think it hasn't fulfilled its part of the deal. The localism bill is far from a bad start, but there is lots more to do. Our wish list, number 1, is financial self-sufficiency. So we should aim for over 50% of local government revenue raised locally by the end of this Parliament. That's actually not that tough. If you look at the figures, we wouldn't need to do lots to do that. I think very importantly that the business rate is part of the answer to that, but actually we need to diversify local government tax rates quite dramatically. I was delighted to see the Conservative MP Douglas Carswell the other day talking about letting local authorities keep fuel duty. I think that's quite an interesting debate to get into. We've also talked a lot about a right to bid and duty to decentralise, which I think is absolutely critical to our vision. This is how we think we get the total place agenda back on track. Our argument is that local government should be able to bid, in the same way that communities can bid to run local services, local government should be able to bid to run central government services, to get those budgets for DWP, for policing, for health, and to use those budgets to commission different kinds of services, more joined up kinds of services. And crucially, we think the government should be under a duty to decentralise. So actually, ministers shouldn't just be able to say, no, we're not going to do that. The presumption should be that money gets localised unless the government can make a case, unless the Secretary of State can make a case for keeping that money central. We think that's probably how you start to drive a very different central-local relationship. That would start to lock in localism in a way that I don't think any of the proposals so far would do. And finally, we think wider reform will be important. My former colleagues at the Institute for Government have pointed out that although there is huge change going on in Whitehall, the government hasn't really set out a vision yet for what Whitehall and civil service should look like and should be doing in 3 to 4 years' time. We think we need a bit more of that, partly because, as I've already said, that the things that we would like to see happen, financial self-sufficiency and rights to bid, will only happen with cross-government buy-in. We need a much more joined-up approach to localism, a much more coherent sense of what localism should mean across government. So those are some of the things that we'll be pushing on, some of the things we'll be researching in the current hearing. You'll find much more detail on all of this in your delegate packs. There's a pamphlet we've released today called Next Localism, which really sets out where we think the debate has got to. The thing that we want to do next, and it's in both the pamphlet and there's a document about it in your delegate packs as well, is the Commission on Next Localism. Basically, we are planning to spend the next financial year, that year of retrenching, doing some really serious work to try and set out what the new agenda should look like for local and central government in terms of localism. I mentioned earlier that we don't think central government will provide the vision. Central government will not tell you what to do. It wants to see what you come up with. So actually, if local government wants that vision and direction, we're going to have to do the thinking ourselves. And our ambition is to be the place that you come to do that. So, the Commission on Next Localism, we're aiming to launch it in April. It will run for the financial year. It will produce a range of outputs over that year. We are starting to look at 6 key strands of work. And you'll see these tied very tightly into the things I've just been saying. So number one, models for the future council. We've got easy council, we've got cooperative councils, we've got Suffolk kind of trying to blow up the council and replace it with a commission model. There are all these new models out there. So 4 or 5 years' time, what are the management models that we might be taking on realistically? What's the menu? What does that look like? Renewing local democracy. Again, I've talked a bit about that. We will need to find new roles for councils. Personally, I think that elected local government will retain a critical role in localities because we just don't have a better alternative. But it needs renewing. We need new things for councils to do. We need new kinds of leadership. Self-sufficient funding, I'm sure I don't need to tell you all about that. We will be having a big push on that, especially over the next few months as we get the review on local government finance underway. We're still hoping that the Secretary of State might say a little bit about that later. Building the hidden wealth of neighbourhoods, we think one of your key roles in local government is building that social capital. We've got a report coming out about in a few months, and that's something we will pursue further. Redefining the role of local government in economic development, I think that's very important, especially in a world of LEPs, in a world where there isn't much capital funding out there. What will local government do and how will it do it? How will it promote economic development? And finally, reforming Whitehall for localism, a subject very, very close to my heart because I used to work on Whitehall reform. I still don't, I think Whitehall is slowly getting this, but I just don't get that sense, I'm sure a lot of you don't either, that there is a really coherent strategy across government for either localism or the big society. And that partly reflects the way that Whitehall is organised. The government is almost ideologically opposed to joining up. They think departments should do policy pretty much in silence. They think that works better. We disagree, and we'll be making that case to them.